participles or dangling modifiers as well, and I'll explain the difference soon. But first, we're going to look at dangling participles. So firstly, what is a participle? Well, a participle, as far as I'm concerned, is a verb that doesn't have a subject. So it's not a verb. It's not functioning as a verb, although it is formed from the verb. So if we look at the first sentence here that we have in front of us, stuck in the mud, comma, Tim could see a man waving. If we break this sentence up into parts of speech, the first thing I want you to notice is there's a comma in the middle, and this comma here is here for incomplete thought, comma, main clause. We've spoken about that before, that if you start with an incomplete thought, it's a very good idea to add a comma before you hit the main clause. Otherwise, there is a chance that you'll write something confusing. So we've got an incomplete piece of information there. And so the main verb in A is could see. Yeah, notice I've used two words, and that's because could is a modal verb and see is the main verb. But that's the main verb of the sentence, could see. It's the main verb in the main clause. It's 100% a verb, could see, because it's got a doer, Tim. Now, you might immediately think there are a few other words that look very much like doing words, and I agree. There are at least two. Firstly, you've got waving, which sounds like you're doing something. And secondly, you've got stuck, which sounds like you're not able to do something. But both of these, sure, they are in other sentences verbs, stuck and waving. But I want to convince you that in this sentence, they're not acting like could see. And that's because they don't have doers. Yeah, it doesn't say a man was waving. It just says a man waving. Yeah, a man waving. It doesn't say a man was waving. A man was waving is an action, and I would agree that was waving is a verb. But a man waving is just an expanded noun phrase. It's just a man doing something, a man waving. You're just taking a noun, man, and expanding it by adding a description, an adjective, a man waving. Okay, so that's a participle. But the participle we're really interested in here is stuck. And you can see that because we've got A, B, C, D stuck in the mud. Now, this exercise wants us to choose the correct answers. Some of these answers are wrong because they contain dangling participles, and some are correct. So what is a dangling participle? Well, the idea is that when you start your sentence with something adjectival, and participles are adjectival, stuck in the mud is describing somebody, we have to be clear about who the stuck in the mud is describing. So is it describing Tim or is it describing the man? And we have to make sure that whoever is stuck in the mud is the subject of the main clause, because that's how we get it correct. If the stuck in the mud is describing the object, like the man, then it's going to be wrong. Okay, so if you look at these four sentences, I think you'll probably agree that it sounds like the man is stuck in the mud. Tim is not stuck in the mud. Yeah, he's somebody who can see him from far away. And the rescue services, the ambulance, is certainly not stuck in the mud. And that's why A is incorrect if Tim isn't stuck in the mud. Yeah, we don't want to make it sound like Tim is stuck in the mud. So A is incorrect because A makes it sound like the participle phrase, the adjectival phrase, is describing Tim. And that's why A is wrong. If Tim is stuck in the mud, then A is correct. But let's assume that the man is and Tim isn't. So A is wrong, therefore. And in B, we've got the correct answer because we've got the man tried. Yes, subject and verb. The man is the subject in the main clause. The man is the one who's stuck in the mud. So B is correct. Same for C. We got the man called, subject and verb. The man is the one that's stuck in the mud. So C is correct. B is correct. C is correct. And D is wrong because it makes it sound like the rescue services are stuck in the mud. But we don't want to say that. So this is how dangling participles work. And it's important when you start the sentence with an adjectival phrase or a participle phrase. Okay. And you can see it here that each sentence starts with a participle phrase. So it's not actually just participle phrases that are important here. There are anything adjectival that's incomplete at the front, any adjectival phrase ought to be clearly related to the subject of the main clause. It ought to be describing the subject of the main clause. So if we try a different website, we'll now try this one here. Okay, and perhaps we'll go a little bit closer. There we go. Look, that's nice and clear. So have a look at here. This is called Dangling Modifiers. This is on a website called Towson University. It's another website that I do enjoy using because it's got some good questions. Now, have a look at number one. Writing carefully, comma, the essay was finished in time to hand in. Now, it sounds like the essay was writing carefully in this sentence, which is why it's wrong. So there are at least two different ways we can correct it. We can say this, we can say writing carefully, comma, I finished the essay with time to hand in. Yeah, I finished the essay on time, if you prefer. Yeah, writing carefully, I. So that's one way you can fix the dangling participle here, along with writing carefully, I, and then just carry on and make sure the I is the subject, yeah, of the verb in the main clause. So I finished the essay on time. Or we could do this. We could say written carefully because the essay was written carefully. Yeah, written carefully. The essay was finished on time. And then that's fine as well, because then your participle written is describing the right noun. The essay was written carefully. But you can't say the essay was writing carefully. It makes it sound like the essay is a person. Yeah, and that's why it's wrong. Okay, so there are at least two ways to fix each question here. Each and every one, there's more than one way to fix it. Let's do number two quickly. My flesh felt creepy. That's our main clause here. I want you to divide sentences up into clauses and phrases in your head each time. My flesh felt creepy is a complete thought. You could put a full stop on the end. That's our main clause. After is a subordinating conjunction or a preposition. And we're going to call it a preposition in this sentence. If it had said after I had seen a movie or after we had seen a movie, then it's a subordinating conjunction because we've got we had seen, we got after, and we got whole clause. So then it's a subordinating conjunction. But if you've just got after lunch, after breakfast, you've got after plus noun, so it's a preposition. Yeah, if you say after breakfast, comma, I went to the shops, and that comma doesn't have to be there, but it might be there, then you're using after as a preposition. Okay, it's a different function of the word after. And here we got after and gerund. Yeah, this seeing is called a gerund. It's a verb functioning as a noun. It's not a participle, but just a gerund when it's after a preposition. So we say that's just a prepositional phrase after seeing a monster movie. Now, the thing is, this after seeing a monster movie, it's got to describe something, the subject, in fact, in the main clause. But was my flesh seeing a monster movie? No. And that's the problem with number two. It makes it sound like your flesh saw a monster movie. And of course, that's not correct. So we need to change this one. We could say my flesh felt creepy after I had seen. We could change after into the subordinating conjunction version, and then it's fine because it's clear that you've got the I had seen, you've got the I, and it's clear that it's I saw a monster movie, and okay, my flesh felt creepy after I had seen a monster movie. So that's fine. That's one way of fixing it. But of course, we can change my flesh to something like I felt scared after seeing. That's fine because after seeing describes the I, and that's okay. Yeah, so the moral of the story here is be careful with your modifying phrases, especially adjectival ones. When it's describing a person, it's got to describe the subject in the main clause. So let's now try something a little more difficult. We're going to try some of those multiple choice questions that they make the kids do for the Ivy League universities, for the GMAT exam. It's just a very good exam. I like how challenging it is. And it's the kind of exam where you learn something, which is, again, why I like it. So let's look at this question. Although covered in about 11 inches of snow, okay, comma, do pay attention to commas. They're giving you information. This comma is saying, here is the end of my incomplete thought, and here is the start of my main clause, my complete thought, yeah? So that's a very important comma. So although covered in about 11 inches of snow, aviation officials, now some of you might even hear that sounds a little bit funny already, Aviation officials said that conditions on the runway at the time of the emergency landing was, sounds a bit weird to me, acceptable. So there are actually a couple of mistakes, if you haven't realised, in that sentence, and that's why it doesn't perhaps feel nice for some of you. But what they're really testing here, if we look down, we see A, aviation officials said. So that's aviation officials as the subject of the main clause. We see B, the runway conditions were acceptable. So in B, the runway conditions is the subject of the main clause. In C, we've got a little interrupting prepositional phrase, according to aviation officials, yeah? Although covered in about 11 inches of snow, comma, according to aviation officials, comma, the runway was. Now, we'll look at that in a second. We'll come back to that one, but that's how it differs from the previous two. In D, we've just got the runway was. So we've got the runway as the subject of the main clause in D. And by the way, we did in C as well, but we've just moved the main clause further away from the starting incomplete thought. Okay, and in E, we've got aviation officials said. Okay, so when we start a sentence with although covered in 11 inches of snow, notice that we've got this verb covered. However, notice that covered has no subject, no overt subject sitting before it, yeah? And so your brain, when you say, although covered in 11 inches of snow, your brain immediately asks you, what was covered in 11 inches of snow? Because your brain needs to know that, yeah? Otherwise, you're just left with that incomplete idea of covered in 11 inches of snow. And you think, well, what is covered in those 11 inches of snow? So we must make the subject of the main clause whatever was covered in 11 inches of snow. And I am sure that you all agree that aviation officials were not covered in 11 inches of snow, and that the runway conditions were not covered. And it must be conditions because we've got were, not was. Yeah, and that's how we know that we got conditions here. Now, can runway conditions be covered in snow? Of course not. It's illogical and irrational to say that the runway conditions were covered in snow. So B is wrong as well. Now in C, what we've done is we've inserted, because there is actually a comma right there, we've inserted an interrupting prepositional phrase, but that's not okay because we don't know, does the prepositional phrase belong in the incomplete thought that although covered in about 11 inches of snow, or does it belong in the main clause? According to aviation officials, the runway was in acceptable condition. And we just don't know because we've commaed it off. And this is the thing with sometimes commaing off your prepositional phrases. Sometimes it will not be clear what they modify if you do this. And really, this is why C is wrong. You've got the runway as the subject of the main clause, but it's far too far away from the covered because of that extra interrupting, according to aviation officials. So I would not choose C for at least that reason. Yeah, and the runway was in acceptable condition during the time of the emergency landing. The rest I don't have a problem with, but I don't like the fact that we've separated the participle phrase at the start, covered in 11 inches of snow, from the main clause with this extra interruption. It makes it harder to understand, harder for the brain to link covered in snow to the runway. Okay, so we're probably not going to go for C. Let's have a look at, and I'm just going to put that in yellow really, because I think that that's the main thing which is poor. It shouldn't be there. The runway was in acceptable condition during the emergency landing, according to aviation officials. Okay, this makes it much clearer what was according to aviation officials. It's the acceptable condition of the runway, according to aviation officials. So that gets that right. And notice it says the runway. We got the runway of the subject to the main clause. And I'm sure you agree that it's the runway that's covered in 11 inches of snow. So D looks good. Let's keep it for the moment. Now we look at E. Aviation officials said. So were the aviation officials covered in snow? No, that's ridiculous. And so we do know that D is the correct answer. Okay, so there's a little example of how you get these really challenging questions correct when they're testing you on dangling participles, because sometimes they'll test you precisely on this. So I don't want to say that all dangling participles are always wrong, by the way. I really don't. I actually think it's quite a strict rule. And if you read this book, Students' Introduction to English Grammar, you'll see that Geoffrey Pullum also thinks that it's a little bit of a strict rule, really, that if you actually read literature, for example, you'll see that they break this rule quite often, in fact. So it's not something that you'll never see broken. It's not a rule you'll never see broken at all. However, when we're writing, we're trying to write clearly. The whole point is to write unambiguously. And the problem with dangling participles is they add an element of ambiguity into the sentence. So if you are going to use them in creative writing, then use them knowingly. Use them when you want to introduce ambiguity into a sentence. That's my advice. Use them effectively. But in any academic writing, you're probably best to err on the side of caution and avoid dangling participles. They don't look good. And a lot of the time when I'm marking essays, it is a dangling modifier that will spoil a sentence or confuse me when I'm reading the sentence. So it's well worth being aware of this grammar, and it's well worth being aware of participles anyway, because participles will get you extra marks. If you've got skillful use of participles in your writing, you will look and sound much more like a writer. All writers love participles. They love using them in various positions and doing various things with their participles. So it's well worth learning about them. And this is another reason why we study dangling participles. Okay, but I'd like you now to have a go at some of the other questions that I've sent you. These questions will be up on my website as well as another 4 multiple choice questions, and you'll be able to do them by going onto my website. But I actually take these from a very challenging exam called the GMAT exam, and it's an exam that they do in America to get into their top universities. And I haven't come across grammar exams that are that difficult, and that's why I like them. They're challenging, they're difficult, but you do learn something. Okay, so thanks everybody for coming today. Hope to see you all soon. I might be along a bit later with a different kind of lesson, maybe a little bit more comma analysis and phrases and clauses in books, because I do enjoy doing that in literature. Okay, so thanks everybody.